lector, antes de nada, tiene que ser un buen lector.
El niño vive en poesía.
Inventar de dónde es que vienen, por ejemplo.
Uno sale a la calle y dice, vi una pulga más grande que un elefante. ¿Acaso no tiene sentido en el libro?
Les explico a los chicos que lo que yo necesito no son musas que bajen, sino una idea.
A ustedes les gustan mucho los cuentos, ¿es verdad?
Poco eso es lo que hay que convertirse también cuando uno es ilustrador, tiene que buscar esa sorpresa, ¿vale?
¿Podemos dibujar también estos sueños?
¡Obvio! Para eso sirve la imaginación.
Vino el viento, lo acunó e hizo semilla de nuevo.
Esto es Filbita, es como un lugar con un clima lindo.
Hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta actividad en la que vamos a conocer un poco más a un autor que está entre los preferidos de lectores y lectoras de todas las edades, Oliver Jeffers. Oliver Jeffers es autor integral, es artista visual y es un gran contador de historias. Sus libros han sido traducidos a más de 40 idiomas y sus obras han sido expuestas en museos de Estados Unidos y de Europa. Es también un autor comprometido con su época. Hoy nos recibe en su casa de Belfast. Queremos agradecer a Benedict que hace posible esta actividad y los invitamos y las invitamos a compartir y comentar las actividades del festival en nuestras redes con el hashtag Filba Online 2020 y el hashtag Filbita10. Y ahora los invitamos a que disfruten de este encuentro. Muchas gracias.
I think everybody is a combination of different stories and different people, and you left one part of that description out there where it's, I always say we're the stories we tell, we're the stories we told, but we're also the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that other people tell about us. So who am I in that instance? I suppose I, like everybody, I'm many people, many different assets. Yes, the story that I tell myself is that I am from Belfast. I lived in Brooklyn and I make art and I tell stories. But yeah, these days I'm also a father and a champion for social justice, and I try to just be a good family member, a good son, a good husband, and yeah, we're all different people, and I don't know if anybody ever is fully under in a sense of understanding of the story of themselves, because that's really up to other people to interpret. But you always have a much stronger sense of the story of other people, I think. So who am I? Not really sure. I would say that I'm from Belfast. I was born in Australia, but my parents, they're both from Northern Ireland, here from Belfast, and they, in the late 1970s, were trying to get away from the political violence here. So they experimented with living in Australia for a couple of years, and it really wasn't for them. But during that 2 or 3 year window that they were there, towards the end of that time, is when I was born. So I was less than a year old, much less than a year old when we traveled back from Australia to Belfast. So Belfast is all I've ever really known. I did go back and live in Sydney in Australia in between my third and final year of art college, because I do have an Australian passport, but I felt very far away from home at that point, from all my family, and so I came back. So Belfast is all I've ever known, and it's both sides of my family. If you follow it back generations and generations and generations, it's all from here. I wasn't really a big reader as a kid. I'd always thought that reading books was homework, or it was a chore that you were doing for somebody else. It was like a thing to be checked off of a list rather than something that you did to entertain or educate yourself. There was only really 1 or 2 books, probably a handful, that I read and enjoyed and then chose to read as a kid. Roald Dahl stands out as being an author. I think that I had to read the BFG for school, but really enjoyed it, and then went on to read the rest of his works and thoroughly enjoyed that. But honestly, it wasn't until I was in art college when I was like in my early 20s that it occurred to me to read for my own enjoyment and for my own education. And I heard a great saying from an educator once that education is what somebody else does to you and learning is what you do to yourself. And my dad's always said that the surest sign of intelligence in other people is not simply remembering facts, because that just proves you've got a good memory. It's a sense of curiosity and imagination. And those things come, I think, from wanting to know something rather than feeling that you should know it. But when I was in art college, the professor at that time handed out a list of 100 classic books that the Guardian newspaper had just printed as the 100 greatest modern works of literature, and he just was asking out of interest, how many books on this list has anybody read? And I'd only read 2 on that list, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to try and get the whole way through that list by the time I graduate college. I didn't. I lost that list, but I did. I worked my way through it, and honestly, by the time that was done, because it was something that I was choosing to do, and I went way off in different tangents, that I've just been an avid reader ever since. When I was a kid, I drew a lot. I loved drawing, and I realized that it was something that I was quite good at. And in some of the early stages, I would use that as an excuse to get out of doing other things. Like, for example, I realized that if they needed my help for the set of the school play, that was much more fun than going to geography class, for example, or the history class. And so I would try and play up to that. And it was only, I think I was about 15 or so when it occurred to me that you could make a living being an artist, that was a real job. But yeah, I always remember doing lots and lots of drawings. And I would draw under the skateboards of a lot of my friends in school, and draw on their school bags and on their casts if somebody broke their arm. It was something that I enjoyed doing an awful lot. And yeah, I think I was younger than most people when it occurred to me that this is something that I could do with the rest of my life. I think even back in those early days when I was just drawing for the sake of it, or even when I was in art college and thinking that my career path was going to be an artist, all of that work was quite narrative. It was all story-based, but I didn't recognize that at the time. I don't think it was until my last year in college when I had an idea for a series of what I thought were going to be just straight paintings, canvases, that it occurred to me that maybe this concept would be better served in a book. And the idea for those canvases was someone trying to physically catch a star. And I had sort of drawn some up, and in talking to a friend, we kind of recognized that, you know, maybe this could be a book, and maybe not just a book, but a picture book. And that's how I finished off my art college. And then after graduating from art college, I thought that this book that I'd made was as good as, if not better than anything else that was out there. So I attempted to go and get it published. And then really that was the start. The publisher asked, do you have any more stories? And I was like, yeah, of course. But I didn't at all. I was just, you know, I think that's what they wanted to hear. And my granddad always joked that if you want to get in somewhere for free, walk in backwards and they'll think you're leaving. And I think that the truth of that is, if you do something with enough confidence, people tend to believe you. So I told them, yeah, I've got lots more stories. I didn't really at all. But then as I started trying, the second book that I made, Lost and Found, was the most difficult, because that was the one that I was trying to piece together from absolute scratch. Because How to Catch a Star had started life as something else and migrated into picture books, but Lost and Found was the first ever book I designed as a picture book. And so trying to really at that point figure out the workflow and the process was one of the more difficult ones. All of those early conversations with your kids are partly storytelling, you know, telling the story of their identity, telling the story of your identity, of what it is that you believe in. You know, stories aren't just once upon a time and fairy tales and folk stories. Stories are things like, you know, the idea of countries, the idea of currency, the idea of any of the structures through which humanity conducts itself. Like they're all made up structures, really, and they only exist because everybody agrees in their imagination that they do. So that's all stories as well. And I just, I think some of the most powerful stories at the minute are stories of anger and fear, unfortunately. And so that's why I really, even with conversations that I have with my kid and with my peers and the people who work with me in the studios, I try to tell a story that's filled with love and hope rather than anger and fear. Whenever our son was born, it didn't occur to me to sit down and write him a book. That's not how Here We Are came to be. There was just something quite, I don't know, there was a beautiful, powerful simplicity in this notion, the humor of giving someone who was only a couple of days old a tour of the home that he was going to live in, our apartment in Brooklyn at that point. And the comedy of that mixed with the magnitude of the sudden realization that actually he really doesn't know anything, and that me and his mother and his immediate family around him and the village around him were responsible for everything that he would know, for the story that he would hear about how life on Earth makes sense. And so I would walk around and I would explain things to him. And as I was walking around, I would take little notes. And the first draft of Here We Are was actually was written to him individually, just as a letter. I was writing him a letter, and I thought he'll maybe get some value out of this when he's old enough to read. But at that point, it was 2015 and leading into 2016, and the two places through which I call home, Brooklyn in New York and Belfast in Northern Ireland, were both and still ongoing, a lot of political turmoil, and there was a lot of talk of Brexit, which was fear of immigration and borders and hard divisions. And in Brooklyn, it was the rise of the extreme conservative, the right wing, and there was a lot of racism, xenophobia, and fear being stoked in those instances. And I thought, not only is this what I'm putting down on paper for my son is valuable for him, but it's also valuable for me to just remember some of these basic principles of what it is to be alive and walking around on Earth in the 21st century. And I thought, if I'm getting value out of this too, maybe other people will as well. And so when he was only a few months old, and I thought, maybe this isn't a letter just for him, but maybe this is a book for everybody. Because I feel like at that point, I felt like everybody could have used just a reminder that there are more people. We share more in common with each other than we share difference, and there are more people who are filled with love than are just angry and malicious. And so that's how Here We Are came about. And with What We'll Build, the book for my daughter, I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at that yet, have you? Well, I'm not sure when What We'll Build is gonna come out in Argentina, but it's basically a poem, and it's about the notion of a shared future with my daughter. And with Here We Are, I was contemplating and trying to make sense of the world from an external perspective and the immediacy of right now. This is what things are like right now, and how to understand how things are right now. Whereas What We'll Build is a much more internal look at the space between two people and a shared imagination, and about how you change the world and looking towards an unknown future. And it talks about what these things that my daughter and I are going to do together as she grows older. And of course, it's all fantastical and completely sort of imaginary. But there's depth to it, and there's warmth to it, and it talks about it's not always going to be good and happy. Not every day is going to be sunny and rosy. There's dark times too, and what do you do in those instances? You sort of fall back on your memories of the happier times, of the love that you have, and it's it's like in the same way that it's much more fun to go out for dinner with someone, or it's more fun to go to the movies with someone or see a play with someone, because it's a shared experience. That's what the power of the relationship between any two loving people is what underpins this book. And my wife always jokes that I have this need to verbalize my plans, where I'll need to talk about the thing that we might potentially do in 3 years or in 2 years, and she always sort of jokes, was like, yeah, do you have to say this out loud? And I was like, yeah, I do. And so sometimes even the negotiating the future, it's just having enough for someone to hear your plans. And that's really what that book is about. But again, in both instances, I didn't really sit down and think, okay, I'm going to write a book for my kid. What's that book going to be? It was more reacting to the world around me and my own internal thought process and how those two things combined. I think that all of the characters and all of the feelings in the books there's a degree of myself in all of them. And I think some of the best work that you create, that you can put out in the world, there's a degree of honesty to it. And so therefore I think, yes, if I've never really created any character and sort of thought and deliberately tried to put characteristics or make them massively different than I am. So just by default, the way that these characters are coming out are extensions of myself. So I think, yeah, there's little bits of me in all of those characters. Maybe with the exception of Fausto, I think. The angry man who ends up drowning himself from his greed and his arrogance. But then again, maybe not. Maybe I think that's why I was coming up with that idea and feeling that notion was, it's the always having to replace things and buy new things, and even fashion cycles that, like a fashion designer will have 4 seasons a year. And like, why? It's like, you don't need a new coat every year. You don't need always to be on top of this fashion that's happening every couple of months or so. It felt like this roller coaster, this merry-go-round that was going faster and faster and faster, and you just wanted to get off. So I think maybe coming up with that character was my way of contemplating that with myself. But even the bear in The Great Paper Caper, there's an element of me which is sort of naively and ignorantly plodding along and not realizing the consequences of your actions. And there's a degree of sort of the slow, quiet and the solitude of the boy character as well. Because like, as gregarious and outgoing as I am, often, most of the time, I just like to not really deal with social situations. So I think there's a little bit of me in all of those characters. In real life, I don't think there's anybody who's very, very good or very, very bad. Nobody sets out to be a baddie. Your motivations often are misconstrued along the way, or the idea that you do something that might be a small step towards immorality or whatever, and then you keep sort of trying to justify your own actions. So I don't think anybody sets out to be evil. That it's just a matter of communication and understanding. And oftentimes it can be easier to just pin somebody as evil and see them as two-dimensional. But I think I read this one, so there's no such thing as good guys and bad guys. They're just people, and every shade of gray in the spectrum. The funny thing is, I don't really think of myself as an author. I think of myself as an artist who uses words as a tool in their art making. I've always loved books as a way. I think it's a very beautiful, simple way for visual storytelling. But I also have one foot in career in just making fine art. So if I didn't have the books, and if I didn't have being an author to fall back on, I think I would just concentrate full time on the fine art work that I do. And these days, that fine art work is dealing with some of that same stuff that I talked about, like just the notion of humanity kind of understanding our position in space, and that we are but one system, and the kind of the harshness of and the very straight and sharp and uninviting edges of the borders of nationalism versus the kind of the soft and warm and inviting edges of culture, which seems to be more celebratory than it is about separation. And also just, I think in my artist statement, I say that I try to find the beauty, the humor, the poignancy, the poetry in the world around me, and make art about it. So I think I would do that. But if you're saying, if this question is extended, if I wasn't an artist, what would I do? So I think I'd probably be unemployable. There's not much I am very good at other than making art and telling stories. Like even today, I was trying to get Photoshop to work on my computer for the first time in a long time, and because I'm in quarantine for 2 weeks and not with in my studio with the other artists around and some people who work with me who are, you know, much younger and understand technology better than I do, I'm clueless and hopeless. So I don't know if anybody would actually hire me if I couldn't draw or tell stories. I think you always draw little tiny bits of inspiration all over the place, and you know, even from the way in which an author might tackle a novel from a slightly strange left of center perspective, or the way in which a play is staged, or the composition choice that a painter might have made. It's always kind of going in. As I've always said, my eyes are open and my ears are open and my brain is a sponge. Half the time, some of the inspiration that I would take for technique would come from lots of little places. Like you might see something and it sort of goes in and you're like, oh, I'll have to try that color combination or something. And then maybe a year later, I'll be working on problem solving something quite differently, and that color combination will pop back to my brain. And, you know, I might not be able to remember where I saw it the first time around. But often I think where I get my main inspiration from is listening to people talk, is reading the news, watching the world around me and how people really feel in real terms and on real time. And I'm always sort of just trying to look for the patterns, the patterns of how that relates to my version of reality or how they relate to each other, and then trying to recreate those patterns, but in the simplest possible ways. And whether that's the feeling of a story, like in the Fate of Fausto, for example, just about the kind of the dread of this unrelenting growth and greed that seems to be completely strangling humanity, or whether that's just the sheer joy of the simplicity of life on Earth, like and here we are. You just never quite know where it's gonna come out or where it's gonna come in. But I always do take notes, because however good an idea or however worthy a piece of inspiration, unless you kind of jot it down or take notes and just recognizing how your own head works, everything in my head stands a completely equal chance of being forgotten. I wouldn't say there's one particular person who I would take most influence from. There's people whose work I really admire, and I'll go back to time and again. You know, like say the whose work I would enjoy, like a Bill Bryson novel, but his work is nothing like mine, or even a Coen brothers film, and again their work is nothing like mine. It's just I know that's they create a vocabulary that I like. And then there are people that I would sort of go to in terms of like, well, how would you problem solve that? Like the author Dave Eggers, there's a strangeness to his writing which I've always liked, but rather than try to emulate that, that's almost, I read that to remind myself that things don't have to be as linear as you kind of convince yourself that they do have to be. And with oil painting, I always seem to find myself going back to John Singer Sargent, but that's more for technical know-how. You know, like how did he make that hand look like a hand, for example. But I wouldn't say that there's a person that I would go to for guaranteed absolute inspiration every single time. I don't think it works out like that, because then if I did, I'd worry that my work would start to represent that person's work too much. The last museum that I went to was when we were on our travels, and we went to see the Olafur Eriksson exhibition in the Tate in London, which was incredible. And again, work completely not anything like mine. I can't wait to go into a museum again just to sort of contemplate a piece of work right in front of me, as opposed to digitally or through a screen. And as far as authors, I'm a bit all over the place. I go between a lot of nonfiction to fiction. I've just started to read the Luminaires, Luminaries, and I can't even remember the name of the author because I just started it. And I also have just finished some non-fiction books, the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century with Noah Yuval Harari. So again, I'm just all over the map. But for us, lockdown has just been very much about being closely connected with family. We've been with our 2 young kids, and we moved to Belfast to be closer to both my wife and my dad's here, and her parents are here, so to be closer with them. So there hasn't been an awful lot of work or even looking at work getting done. It's been mostly family time, which has been good. I think silence is very important. But I think silence is not even the absence of music, but just quiet inside your head, so that you can finish a thought and follow a thought to its logical conclusion, rather than just moving a million miles an hour and always on to the next, always on to the next. It's just having moments to contemplate and reflect on something that you've just read, done, seen, or heard. But yes, music, when I'm working, I do like to listen to music. I used to be much more on the pulse of what was happening musically around the world with new bands, new albums. But these days, it's especially since the invention of things like Spotify and music streaming services, where you just need to press a button once at the start of the day and then you don't really think about it again. That's made me, I think, kind of lazy in terms of who I'm listening to and what I'm listening to. I notice bad music, so I'll skip something, but I can't listen to anything that's too irritating, and anything, even trying to listen to a podcast while I'm working. If there's words in it, I'm just not hearing them at all. So I think naturally that has led me down a road to starting to listen to classical radio much more often, because it's there, but you don't notice it as much. I did think I was getting out of a book tour for my new book, but I'm not traveling anywhere, and it's now a virtual tour, so I get to not leave home and still speak to all of these people. But it's different, it's not the same. It's at least in an event or a book signing, you get to meet the people, whereas right now what I'm looking at is myself on my phone balanced on a plastic bottle of water on our kitchen table, and I no clue if anybody else is going to be watching this or ever will be watching this. So it's, there's no engagement, there's no feedback, there's no sense of audience, really. It's strange, and I don't know. This has to happen a couple of different times with some other festivals, and I think it does mean that I can go to places that I wouldn't have been able to go, like Buenos Aires, for example, because I try to limit my travel generally. And so there'll be a European trip once a year, and I'll be based in Brooklyn, and anything that would be too far outside of that just would never happen. So South America I've always wanted to go, but it's just never worked out quite for me schedule-wise, and the same with really anything in the Southern Hemisphere. Now that we've got a young family and I kind of work 2 separate careers in the fine art world and publishing world, it just hasn't, there hasn't been the time to really travel. And so that's the one advantage of doing a virtual book tour, is that there's no travel time. It doesn't really matter where any of these destinations are, because it's still me sitting at home and talking to a computer screen. There were lots of places that I would go. Like I'd been to Mexico a couple of times, and I'd been to Malaysia and Hong Kong, and I would go to these places, and then I'd come back and people would ask me what it was like. I was like, I don't really know, because I just saw the airport and a conference center and a bookshop, and then that was it. And it just seemed like a real pity to spend all that time traveling and not really actually experience a place. So I think when travel becomes more normal, rather than just popping to a place for a day or two to do what needs to be done and then leaving, is to try and maybe build in some more time to actually experience the local culture. Well, this is a place that we don't normally live. So I'm in Belfast at the minute. We're in a small 2-bedroom apartment, so it's definitely been on the small side for quarantine with 2 young kids, but we've been making the most of it. This is my quarantine calendar now. Things did ease up, but we just popped back to New York for a week, for some basic work things, and we're now quarantining, just my wife and I, for 2 weeks alone in this apartment. But we're in the center of Belfast. If we look out the window, we can see the docks. We can see the Titanic Museum, because Belfast famously made the Titanic ship, and this is where it set off from. And actually just out the window there is the nomadic ship, which is a much smaller version that was made at the same time as the Titanic, and it was the boat that brought the first class passengers to the Titanic. And so it's maybe 50 yards from the window that we can see, so that's a nice view. But this is very temporary dwellings until we can figure out somewhere more permanent to live while we're going to be here in Belfast for the next few years. A small balcony, so whenever lockdown was in its extreme, we only got the sun for 15 minutes a day, and the balcony is maybe the size of a snooker table, and so even our daughter would quickly shout, it was like, the sun's here, and we would all cram outside on the days that it was sunny, because Northern Ireland is not known for its dry and hot weather. It rains most of the time. So in those days that there were sun, we would all just run outside and try and get our dose of vitamin D for that 15-minute period. What I miss most about my life in New York, I think, is the energy of the city and the people and the conversations. I worked in a building that had several other artists, and many of whom were some of my closest friends, and just the conversations about culture, about art, about politics, and even just running an idea past someone in person and hearing that repeated back to you is almost as good as anything else. But yeah, there's just the quality and the integrity of the people that surrounded our lives, and also the food. We really miss the food in New York, and going to the museums and shows. But of course, that version of New York doesn't really exist right now. There's people can eat outside in restaurants at the minute, but the museums, when we were there anyway, they hadn't reopened yet. So it's the New York that we miss isn't there currently. It will be back, but it's the people that we miss most. I think it did make me wonder that last year that we were in New York before we went traveling, we were just working the entire time, and we didn't really go to any museums or any plays or anything that are the reasons that people pay the money to live in New York City. And it makes me think back on that with regret, and not knowing obviously what was going to be coming down the pipeline. But it was, you got to take time for yourself and to just tap into your environment. And if you're in New York, that means that you got to get out. You got to stop and just get out there and be in the city and sort of feel the moment and take the temperature and feel the pulse and do those sorts of things. So I whenever this is all over, I won't take that stuff for granted again. Post-COVID, post-lockdown, and even when that will be. I think people already are traveling less, working from home, maybe working slightly less hard than they were, and spending more time with family and remembering all of the things that it is that they actually want the most, rather than just sort of the idea of more, bigger, better, faster, and newer. We're excited about trying to get a little bit of a stability and a rhythm back into our lives, which we haven't managed yet, but we're getting there. And really just spending more time with family over the next couple of years, and seeing how that just sort of affects the actual output of the work that I do. Which is the new one. I go like this. So, what we'll build. To my daughter Mary, we have much to do. And then it says here, only when you're not battling to survive the present. To all those fathers and daughters in this orb whose odds are stacked less fortuitously than ours, our aim is to even the field. What we'll build. Plans for our together future. What shall we build, you and I? Let's gather all our tools for a start. For putting together and taking apart. Let's build a door where there was none. We'll build a house to be our home. I'll build your future and you'll build mine. We'll build a watch to keep our time. We'll build some love to set aside and build a hole where we can hide. A fortress to keep our enemies out. And higher walls for when they shout. But you don't always lose and you don't always win, so we'll build a gate to let them in. We'll build a table to drink our tea and say, I'm sorry, me too, me three. We'll build a tower to watch the sky and other worlds that pass us by. Let's build a tunnel to anywhere. Let's build a road up to the moon. Let's build a comfy place to rest, for we'll be tired soon. Let's build a ship that can't be broken, that will not sink or be cracked open. A place to stay when all is lost, to keep the things we love the most. We'll put these favorite things beside when times are hard and needs are greater. But first things first, let's build a fire, for we've planned a lot and now we're tired. It'll keep us warm like when we're born, and then we'll say goodnight as all's all right. These are the things we'll build, you and I. The end.